Rain slammed against the glass like it was trying to wake the house. Thunder rolled across the hills, shaking the chandeliers in the empty ballroom. And in that storm, headlights appeared, white, slicing through the night like judgment. A black limousine crawled up the long driveway of the Marlowe estate. The staff froze. No one expected him home. Not tonight. Not on the eve of his wedding. The door of the limousine opened, and out stepped Ethan Marlowe, billionaire, CEO, father in name only. His suit was pressed, his eyes sharp, but his soul looked hollow. He adjusted his cufflinks as if time itself should wait for him to finish. The rain didn't dare touch him. Inside, Grace paused mid-sweep, her broom still against the marble. For 6 years, she had walked these halls, seen the parties, the press, the privilege. But this moment felt different. When she saw Ethan's reflection in the foyer mirror, her heart stopped. The man who never said thank you. The man who left his little boy to grow up in silence while he chased headlines and numbers. Grace's chest tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron, unsure if she should curtsy or look away. But before she could decide, the butler whispered, "He wasn't supposed to come." Upstairs, a soft whimper. Ethan's son, little Oliver, was hiding behind his mother's old sketchbook, the one he never let go of. A drawing of her face was clutched against his chest, the pencil lines fading from all the times his tears had fallen there. He had never quite understood why she was gone, but he knew her warmth wasn't in this house anymore. Only Grace tried to fill that space, with bedtime stories whispered in the dark, with a hug that made him believe he wasn't forgotten. Ethan climbed the staircase, his shoes echoing with authority. Every step was practiced, every movement precise. He expected admiration. Instead, the air around him felt heavy. Distant thunder rolled again, and then, suddenly, a scream cut through the silence. Sharp, piercing, coming from the ballroom below. Ethan turned instantly, his instincts kicking in. He rushed down the stairs, pushing open the heavy doors. What he saw made him stop cold. His fiancée, Vanessa, was standing over his son, gripping the boy's arm so tightly that her nails left marks. Her designer gown was stained with cake and tears. "You ruined my dress," she hissed through perfect teeth. The guests had long gone home. The servants stood frozen, too afraid to intervene. Only Grace moved, stepping between them, her body trembling, but her voice firm. "That's enough," she said. Vanessa's face twisted. "Enough. He destroyed everything." Grace stood taller. "He's a child. He didn't destroy anything worth more than his heart." Ethan's voice thundered through the room. "What is going on here?" Everyone turned. Vanessa pointed at the boy. "Your son thought it would be funny to play with the cake. He ruined everything." Grace's breath was steady now. Her eyes met Ethan's, dark, unflinching, filled with a truth too long buried. "What's going on, sir," she said slowly, "is that your son is being terrified by the woman you're about to marry." The words hung in the air like lightning frozen mid-flash. The room went silent. Vanessa's face flushed red. Ethan blinked, speechless. The boy clung to Grace's skirt, his small fingers gripping for safety. For a moment, all you could hear was the storm. Ethan looked at Vanessa, then at his son, then at Grace. His jaw tightened. He had faced boardrooms, rivals, lawsuits. But never this. Never something he couldn't buy his way out of. He wanted to speak, to command, to control. But his tongue felt heavy. Grace's gaze didn't move. She wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. "Take your hands off my son," Ethan finally said. Vanessa froze, her eyes darting. "Your son? Since when do you care about?" He cut her off. "Now." She stepped back, her heels clicking across the marble. Grace bent down, comforting the boy, whispering something only he could hear. Ethan watched, uncomfortable, conflicted, ashamed. It was the first time he had seen someone protect his son from pain, not polish him for appearances. Vanessa tried to recover, her voice trembling. "Ethan, she disrespected me. Are you really taking her side?" Grace stood, her hands shaking but her voice calm. "I'm not on anyone's side, ma'am. I'm on the side of what's right." The boy hid his face against her waist, and the thunder outside rolled again, as if the heavens agreed. Ethan said nothing. He walked out, slowly, his shoes leaving water on the marble. The weight of silence followed him down the corridor. Behind him, Vanessa glared at Grace, her lips curling into a venomous smile. "You'll regret this," she whispered. Grace didn't respond. She held the boy tighter. Her heart ached, not for herself, but for the child whose laughter had been lost inside this golden cage. Later that night, after the storm passed, Ethan stood by his study window, looking out at the garden his late wife once designed. He saw Grace walking the boy back to his room, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Something inside him cracked, the faint memory of love that money couldn't measure. He didn't know it yet, but that night had planted the first seed of change. Because once a truth like that is spoken aloud, you can't silence it again. The next morning, whispers filled the halls. Vanessa demanded that Grace be removed. "She embarrassed me," she told Ethan. "She humiliated this family." Ethan didn't answer. He just poured himself another drink and stared into it, seeing reflections of everything he'd ignored. Outside, Grace packed the boys' breakfast, as she did every morning. She hummed a quiet tune from her childhood, one that carried warmth through cold spaces. She didn't know what would happen next. She only knew one thing: the boy needed someone who saw him, not his father's fortune. In another part of the mansion, Vanessa stood at the mirror, adjusting her diamond earrings. Her eyes were cold. "I want her gone," she said again. "Today." The butler hesitated. "Madam, she's been here 6 years." "The boy." "I said today." Ethan walked in, his tone distant. "Do what she says." Grace heard the footsteps long before they reached her door. She knew what was coming. She folded the boy's shirt neatly, set it beside his lunchbox, and whispered, "Be brave, little one." The head maid came to her quietly, eyes full of pity. "Grace, I'm sorry. Orders from above." Grace nodded. "I understand." But as she left, the storm outside began again, soft at first, then louder. The sky seemed unwilling to let the night end peacefully. As she stepped through the servants' gate, Grace turned one last time toward the mansion. Her eyes lingered on the boy's window, where a small hand pressed against the glass. She smiled through the tears, lifting her hand in return. Inside, Ethan stood in the shadows, watching. Torn. Haunted. He didn't know it yet, but he had just let go of the only person who ever truly protected what mattered most. And as thunder rolled once more across the hills, the world seemed to whisper a truth he could no longer ignore: this was not the end. It was the beginning of his reckoning. The morning after the storm felt strangely quiet. The mansion that once buzzed with servants and laughter now echoed with absence. The marble floors gleamed, but something inside those walls had dimmed. Grace's room was empty, her neatly folded uniforms gone, the Bible she kept by her bedside missing, the faint smell of lavender polish fading from the air. Vanessa had made sure of it. She called it discipline. Ethan called it order. But the boy, little Oliver, called it what it truly was: loss. He sat at the breakfast table, small hands resting on a plate he didn't touch. The seat beside him, the one Grace used to fill with quiet warmth, stood empty. Vanessa smiled too brightly, pretending everything was fine. "Eat, sweetheart," she said, her voice sugar over poison. Oliver didn't move. His father looked up from his tablet, distracted, pretending to read news headlines that no longer mattered. "Ethan," Vanessa said lightly, "I've handled the situation. That woman was toxic. You don't have to worry about her influence anymore." He nodded absently, his mind somewhere else. The silence between him and his son stretched like a wound. He tried to ignore the ache forming in his chest, the memory of Grace standing tall the night before, her voice steady against his fiancée's cruelty. Later that day, as rainwater dried on the windows, Grace was walking down a dirt road miles away, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The shoes she'd worn in that mansion for 6 years were now caked with mud. Her hands shook as she clutched the small envelope containing her final pay. A pittance for all those years of care, devotion, and love. The other maids had whispered as she left. "You shouldn't have spoken up," one said, eyes low. "You don't fight people like them. You lose." Grace smiled faintly. Sometimes losing is the only way to stay human. Back at the mansion, Ethan tried to focus on his meetings. His assistant reminded him of the investor call. His PR team wanted a statement about the wedding. But his mind kept drifting, not to profits, not to numbers, but to his son's quiet eyes at breakfast. The boy hadn't spoken all morning. That night, Ethan walked into Oliver's room. The walls were lined with toy airplanes, expensive and untouched. The boy sat on his bed, clutching his mother's drawing again. Ethan sat beside him, unsure what to say. The silence was thick. Then, softly, the boy whispered, "Dad." Grace said love doesn't shout. Ethan froze. The words hit him like glass. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. He just stared at his son, realizing that he didn't even know how to talk to him, his own child. Across town, Grace sat in a dim apartment she could barely afford, folding her apron and placing it gently in a drawer. It wasn't just a job she'd lost. It was a home, a child she had loved as her own, a piece of her heart. She took out a pen and paper and began to write. Not for revenge, not for pity, but for truth. She wrote about the nights the boy cried himself to sleep. About the way Vanessa screamed when the cameras weren't there. About how Ethan, brilliant, powerful, adored, had turned blind to the quiet pain beneath his own roof. It wasn't a letter meant for anyone to read. It was confession. Healing. Her heart poured onto paper. When she finished, she folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope. She tucked it between the pages of her Bible. "Let the truth rest," she whispered. But truth never rests. A week later, headlines began to swirl online. Anonymous source claims billionaire's bride is abusive. Another headline followed, "Inside the Marlowe mansion, what the cameras don't show." The story spread like fire. Vanessa's smile turned brittle. She denied everything, called it jealousy, called it lies. But she couldn't deny the details. Details only someone inside that house would know. Ethan's PR team panicked. He told them to bury the story, but it was too late. The world had smelled the rot behind the glamour. Investors pulled back. Magazines questioned the upcoming wedding. His empire trembled. Vanessa stormed through the halls, her voice sharp. "You think she's behind this, don't you?" she snapped. "That woman is trying to destroy me." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down, he wondered if this was justice, the kind he had always tried to avoid. He remembered the look in Grace's eyes that night, the disappointment, the courage. The way she shielded his son without hesitation. Meanwhile, Grace had no idea her letter had somehow found its way into the world. Maybe she'd left it behind. Maybe fate had picked it up. All she knew was that her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages she didn't want to read. "Grace, is this you? Did you tell the papers?" She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Truth had its own wings. At the mansion, Ethan watched Vanessa pacing the living room, shouting into her phone, defending herself to anyone who would listen. The boy sat quietly in the corner, holding a small paper airplane Grace had folded for him long ago. When Ethan looked at his son, he saw the truth reflected there, not in the headlines, not in the gossip, but in the quiet trust that had been broken. That night, Ethan walked outside into the cold air. For the first time in years, he felt small. The rain began to fall again, soft and steady. It hit his skin, washed the dust from his expensive suit. He thought of Grace, her voice, her strength, her unshakable dignity. The world could accuse her, dismiss her, fire her, but it could never erase her. Inside, Vanessa sat in front of the mirror, makeup smeared, pride cracked. "You have to do something," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't let this ruin us." Ethan turned to her slowly. "Maybe it's not ruining us," he said quietly. "Maybe it's revealing us." Vanessa glared, speechless. When he walked away, he didn't know where he was going, only that something inside him had shifted. The empire he built on control was crumbling, and in its collapse, he began to see the truth, that love, respect, and loyalty could never be commanded. They had to be earned. Somewhere across the city, Grace closed her eyes and prayed. Not for revenge. Not for forgiveness. Just for peace. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she trusted that justice, in its own quiet way, would find her. And it did. Because that night, as lightning cracked across the sky, the world had already begun to change, and none of them knew that what came next would expose not just the lies inside the Marlowe mansion, but the hearts behind them. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of truth finally waking. Weeks passed, and the world outside the Marlowe estate moved on, but inside those marble walls, the air was heavy with unease. The upcoming charity gala, once meant to showcase Ethan and Vanessa's perfect union, now felt like a performance neither believed in. The headlines had cooled, but whispers still floated through every room, every corner. The abusive bride. The missing maid. The billionaire's secret scandal. Vanessa had forced a smile for the cameras, but behind that mask, cracks were spreading fast. Ethan stood before his mirror, adjusting his tie for the 5th time, but his reflection didn't look back like it used to. The eyes staring at him now weren't confident, weren't proud. They were tired. Haunted. The boy, Oliver, watched from the doorway, silent as ever. He had stopped calling Vanessa Miss Vanessa. He barely looked at her. When Ethan crouched to tie his son's shoelaces, the boy whispered, "Will Grace be there?" Ethan froze, his fingers tightening on the laces. "No," he said quietly, "Grace doesn't work here anymore." The child lowered his head. "She still cares about me, though." Those words lingered all the way to the gala. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers and money. Cameras flashed. Politicians, CEOs, and socialites mingled, their laughter echoing under crystal lights. Ethan smiled mechanically, shaking hands, posing for photos beside Vanessa, whose gown shimmered gold but whose heart was heavy with dread. She leaned toward him between smiles and whispered, "Keep your composure. They smell weakness." Ethan nodded, but something inside him was cracking, the same invisible crack that started the night Grace stood up to her. Hours into the evening, as the orchestra played, Ethan stepped to the podium to deliver his speech, a rehearsed display of gratitude and power. But before he could begin, a small voice broke through the chatter. A voice that didn't belong there. "Grace." Every head turned. The music faltered. The crowd parted like a tide, and there she was, Grace, standing in the grand doorway, wearing a simple white dress that caught the light. Her posture was calm, her expression steady. She didn't belong to their world, yet somehow, in that moment, she owned it. Oliver broke free from his nanny's grasp and ran across the ballroom, calling her name again. Cameras flashed wildly. Gasps rippled through the guests. Grace knelt down, gathering the child in her arms, holding him close the way only a mother could. The boy buried his face against her shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Security began to move forward, but Ethan raised his hand. "Wait." His voice cut through the noise. Vanessa's face turned red. "She's trespassing," she spat. "This is a private event." Grace rose slowly, still holding Oliver's hand. Her voice was soft but unshakable. "No, ma'am. I was invited." The crowd murmured. Vanessa looked at Ethan, eyes wide. "You invited her?" Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at Grace, at the quiet dignity that had once stood between his son and cruelty. He couldn't speak, but she could. Grace stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the room. "You all see glamour tonight," she began, her words calm but clear. "But behind these walls, I saw something else. I saw a child forgotten by love. I saw a man blinded by pride. And I saw what happens when truth gets buried to protect comfort." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Oh, please, don't turn this into some sob story. You're nothing but—" Grace cut her off with a single look. "I was the one who held your fiancé's son when he cried at night. I was the one who taught him not to be afraid. And I was the one who stood up when you hurt him. You called that disrespect. I call it love." Gasps rippled through the audience. The cameras caught everything. Vanessa's voice trembled. "You're lying." Grace reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to Ethan. "I wrote this weeks ago," she said. "I never meant for anyone to read it. But somehow, the truth has a way of showing up, even when you try to hide it." Ethan opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was the same letter that had ignited the headlines, her handwriting raw, emotional, real. As he read, his eyes widened. The crowd watched him, waiting. Then, suddenly, one of the large screens flickered to life. A security guard had connected the surveillance feed. "Sir," he stammered, "you need to see this." And then, there it was. The footage from that stormy night. Ethan's unannounced arrival. Vanessa screaming. Grace shielding the boy with her arms as if her body alone could stop the world from breaking him. The sound was faint, but the image said enough. The room went silent. The only sound was rain, faintly tapping against the windows. Ethan's throat tightened. He looked up from the screen, his eyes filled with something unfamiliar, shame. Then he looked at Vanessa. She was pale, trembling, her perfect image crumbling in front of hundreds of eyes. "Ethan, you can't believe this," she began, but he interrupted softly. "I don't need to believe it. I can see it." Vanessa's lip quivered. The crowd began to whisper. Some recorded on their phones. Others turned away. She looked around, desperate, but no one defended her. For the first time, she was truly alone. Grace turned, ready to leave. "I didn't come to ruin anyone," she said gently. "I came to remind you, a child's heart is worth more than any empire." Ethan's voice cracked. "Grace!" He took a step forward. "Thank you." The hall fell silent again. The weight of those two words, words he had never said before, seemed to echo off the marble walls. Grace nodded, her eyes soft but tired. "Take care of him," she said, glancing toward Oliver. "He deserves to know what love sounds like." Vanessa tore off her earrings, fury burning through her humiliation. "You'll regret this," she hissed. But no one listened. She stormed out of the ballroom, cameras chasing after her like vultures after a fallen queen. Ethan stood frozen. The empire he had built on appearances, on silence, on control. It was cracking, but for once he didn't fear the ruin. Because what he saw standing before him wasn't shame. It was truth. Grace turned toward the door, her hand still holding Oliver's. "Come visit me someday," she whispered to him. "When you're ready." The boy nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. As she walked out, the applause began, hesitant at first, then stronger, rising through the hall. People didn't just see a maid anymore. They saw a woman who had stood up for love when everyone else bowed to power. Ethan watched her go, his chest heavy, his throat tight. For once, the billionaire didn't know what to say. He just stood there, hands trembling, the letter still open in his palm. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft, cleansing, relentless. Inside, the man who had everything finally realized he'd been bankrupt in the one currency that mattered most. And as the doors closed behind Grace, he knew, power had finally bowed to decency. The night after the gala, the city couldn't stop talking. Every news channel replayed the same clip, Grace standing beneath the chandeliers, speaking truth to power while Vanessa Marlowe's empire crumbled in real time. Hashtag the Maid Who Spoke was trending across every platform. But while the world debated, analyzed, and applauded, the three souls at the center of it all were unraveling in silence. Vanessa locked herself inside her penthouse suite, surrounded by empty champagne glasses and shattered mirrors. Her reflection mocked her, the once unshakable socialite reduced to whispers and pity. Endorsements withdrew. Invitations vanished. The tabloids called it the fall of the Marlowe bride. But none of that hurt as much as knowing the man she fought to control, Ethan, no longer answered her calls. Meanwhile, in a small cottage on the edge of the city, Grace was hanging laundry in the gentle morning wind. The world's chaos didn't touch her there. Her life was simple again. Soft music, steaming tea, and silence broken only by the birds. She had no idea that people were calling her a hero. All she wanted was peace. But even peace, she soon learned, carries its own price. A knock echoed through the quiet. When she opened the door, Ethan stood there. No suit. No tie. Just a man stripped of everything except honesty. His eyes were tired, but his voice was steady. "Grace," he said softly, "I didn't come to apologize. I came to understand." For a moment, she didn't answer. The memories of humiliation, of the night she was accused and dismissed, came flooding back. But something about his tone, fragile, almost human, made her step aside. "Come in." He walked into the small living room, scanning the handmade curtains, the worn couch, the framed photo of a younger Grace with her mother. "It's beautiful here," he said quietly. "It's real," she replied. They sat in silence for a while, both unsure where to begin. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I watched the footage 100 times. Every time, I hated myself more. You tried to protect my son, and I punished you for it." Grace looked up, her voice calm. "You didn't punish me, Ethan. You punished yourself. You just haven't realized it until now." He swallowed hard, leaning forward. "I built my life on control, money, image, perfection. But I can't even look my own son in the eye anymore. He doesn't trust me." His voice cracked. "He barely speaks." Grace's expression softened. Children don't need perfect parents. They just need to see their parents try. Her words hit him like truth always does, quietly but deeply. He nodded slowly. "You were the only one who ever told me the truth. Everyone else just told me what I wanted to hear." Grace smiled faintly. "That's because everyone else feared losing what they had. I had nothing to lose." He looked at her then, really looked. The same woman he once dismissed as invisible now seemed to hold the only kind of wealth that mattered. After a pause, Ethan reached into his coat pocket and handed her a sealed envelope. "This belongs to you," he said. "A settlement, the one my lawyers prepared when you left. I never sent it. I thought I was protecting my reputation. Turns out, I was protecting my pride." Grace didn't take it. She folded his hand back around it gently. "I don't want your money, Ethan. I never did." He stared at her, bewildered. "Then what do you want?" Her eyes met his, steady, kind, and unafraid. "I want you to be the father your son believes you can be. That's all." Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. He exhaled slowly, years of pressure spilling out in one breath. "I don't know how," he whispered. Grace smiled softly. "Start by listening." And so he did. For the first time in years, Ethan listened, not to investors, not to advisors, but to his own silence. He stayed for hours, helping her cook, watching the simplicity of a life built on truth instead of image. When he left that evening, he hugged her before he walked out. It wasn't romantic. It was something rarer, redemptive. Days later, news broke that Vanessa had fled to Europe, chased by lawsuits and scandal. The empire she tried to build on control had collapsed into ashes. And for the first time, the world didn't care. They had already moved on, to something better. In one of the final scenes of this quiet storm, a small boy stood at a wooden gate, clutching a toy truck. Grace stepped out, surprised. "Oliver." The boy grinned. "Daddy brought me. He's waiting by the car." Ethan waved from the distance, then turned away to give them space. Oliver handed Grace a folded drawing, stick figures holding hands beneath a blue sky. "That's us," he said proudly. Grace knelt, tears glistening in her eyes. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." He hugged her tightly, whispering, "Daddy says you taught him what love means." She smiled through her tears. "Then maybe I did something right." As the car drove away, the sunset bathed everything in gold. Grace stood at her gate, watching the boy wave until the horizon swallowed him. She wasn't rich, but her heart was full. She had lost everything, her job, her name, her comfort, but somehow she had gained something unbreakable. And miles away, as Ethan drove down the winding road, he looked at his son in the rearview mirror, smiling for the first time in months, and realized Grace had given him back more than dignity. She had given him a second chance at being human. In the end, there were no grand speeches, no headlines worth keeping. Just quiet redemption, a child's laughter, and a maid who taught a billionaire that love, the kind that protects, forgives, and restores, is the rarest form of wealth there is. And that was how the story truly ended, not with revenge or ruin, but with grace.